The crystal chandeliers sparkled like frozen tears above the marble foyer, casting fractured rainbows across walls that had never heard laughter. Catherine Moretti stood with her single battered suitcase, her hands trembling slightly as the butler's disapproving gaze swept over her worn shoes and second-hand coat. She was 23 years old, carrying a nursing degree she couldn't afford to complete and debts that followed her like shadows. The job posting had been simple. Live-in maid for the Winchester estate, room and board included, salary generous enough to save her drowning family. What it hadn't mentioned was the silence that hung over this mansion like a shroud, or the boy in the wheelchair who sat motionless by the window, staring at nothing. "The master will see you now," the butler intoned, and Catherine followed him through corridors that smelled of expensive emptiness and old grief. James Winchester III sat behind a desk that probably cost more than Catherine's childhood home. At 42, he still carried the sharp-featured handsomeness of old money, but his eyes were hollows, and his shoulders curved inward as though protecting a wound that never healed. He barely looked up when she entered. "You understand the position?" he asked, his voice flat. "General household duties. My son requires no special attention. We have nurses for that. You'll clean, cook when the chef is off, and maintain discretion about our family affairs." "Can you do that?" Catherine hesitated. In that pause, she heard something that made her stomach clench, a crash from somewhere above, followed by shouting, then nothing. James Winchester didn't even flinch. "Your son," she began carefully, the posting mentioned. "My son is not your concern." The words came out like a blade. "He has every medical professional money can buy. What he doesn't need is another person trying to fix what can't be fixed. Do we understand each other?" Catherine should have agreed. She needed this job desperately. Her mother's medical bills were crushing them. Her younger sister's college fund had been raided to pay for treatments that hadn't worked. This salary could save them all. But she'd spent 3 years in nursing school before the money ran out, and she'd learned to hear what people didn't say. In James Winchester's rigid control, she heard terror. In his dismissal of his son, she heard unbearable guilt. "I understand," she said quietly, which wasn't quite a lie. She met Ethan Winchester on her 3rd day. She'd been cleaning the library when she heard the soft whir of an electric wheelchair. He appeared in the doorway like a ghost, 12 years old, with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes, which Catherine knew only from the portraits that lined the stairs. Margaret Winchester had died 4 years ago. Everyone in town knew the story, whispered it in grocery stores and coffee shops with that particular tone reserved for tragedies involving the wealthy. The accident had killed Margaret instantly. Ethan had survived, but the spinal injury left him paralyzed from the waist down. "That's what the doctors said. That's what everyone believed. You're new," Ethan said. His voice was soft, carefully neutral, the voice of someone who'd learned not to hope for anything. "I'm Catherine. Cat, if you prefer. They usually don't last long. The new people." He said it without accusation, just stating a fact. "My dad fires them, or they quit. Last one made it 6 weeks. Catherine sat down on the arm of a leather chair, making herself level with his gaze. Up close, she could see the tightness around his eyes, the way his hands gripped the wheelchair arms even when sitting still. "Why do they leave?" Ethan shrugged, a gesture that seemed to carry the weight of years. "Dad doesn't want anyone bothering me. The nurses aren't allowed to talk to me except about medical stuff. The tutors teach from a script. Everyone acts like I'm made of glass." He paused. "Or like I'm already gone." The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. She'd seen it in nursing school, patients who received every medical intervention but no human connection, who were treated as collections of symptoms rather than people. It was efficient. It was also a kind of death. "What do you want?" she asked. Ethan blinked, confused. "What? If you could have anything right now, what would it be?" He stared at her as though she'd spoken a foreign language. Then, slowly, something shifted in his face, a crack in the careful blankness. "I want to go outside," he whispered. "Really outside, not just the terrace. I want to feel grass. I want to go to the creek at the edge of the property. Before the accident, Mom used to take me there. We'd catch tadpoles and build forts from fallen branches." His voice broke slightly. "I dream about it sometimes. The sound of the water. The way the sunlight came through the trees." Catherine made her decision in that moment, knowing it might cost her everything. "Tomorrow," she said, "after your father leaves for the office. I'll take you." She expected joy, but what she saw was fear. "The path isn't paved," Ethan said. "The wheelchair can't. Then we'll figure it out." That night, Catherine researched all-terrain wheelchairs and found nothing in the Winchester garage except medical equipment that looked barely used. She discovered something else, though, while putting away laundry in Ethan's room. Hidden under his bed were physical therapy logs from 2 years ago, marked with notes in a frustrated hand. Patient shows no motivation. Refuses exercises. Recommend psychiatric evaluation. But there were older logs too, from right after the accident. Patient demonstrates strong will. Pain tolerance high, showing early signs of potential mobility recovery with intensive therapy. Something had changed. Something had broken in Ethan that had nothing to do with his spine. She found James Winchester in his study at midnight, working through papers with the mechanical determination of a man avoiding sleep. "Mr. Winchester, I need to ask you something about Ethan." His jaw tightened. "I told you. Why did he stop trying?" The question landed like a stone in still water. James's face went white, then red, then carefully blank. "That's not your business. He told me he wants to go to the creek. The place he used to go with his mother." James stood abruptly, knocking papers to the floor. Don't you dare bring her into this." Catherine held her ground, even as her heart hammered. "Mr. Winchester, I read his physical therapy logs. 2 years ago he just stopped. The doctors said he lost motivation, but that's not it, is it?" Something happened. The silence stretched so long she thought he might fire her on the spot. Then James Winchester did something she suspected he rarely did. He collapsed back into his chair and told the truth. "It was my fault," he said, his voice barely audible. "The accident. We were arguing, Margaret and I. Something stupid about my work hours, about missing Ethan's soccer game. I was driving. I was angry. I didn't see the truck run the light until too late." He pressed his hands over his face. "She died instantly. Ethan, when he woke up in the hospital and realized he couldn't walk, the first thing he asked was whether it was his fault. Whether he'd distracted me. And what did you tell him?" "I told him," James's voice cracked. "I told him the truth. That it was my fault. That I'd been arguing with his mother. That my anger killed her and took his legs." Catherine felt tears burning her eyes, and he heard that he was part of the argument. That his existence, his needs, were the reason for the fight. "I was trying to take the blame. You gave it to both of you. And then you built this fortress where nobody's allowed to feel anything or want anything or try for anything because trying means risking more loss." She stepped closer. "Mr. Winchester, your son hasn't given up on walking. He's given up on deserving to walk." The words hung in the air like an accusation and an absolution at once. "I don't know how to fix this," James whispered. "Neither do I," Catherine admitted. "But tomorrow, I'm taking him to the creek. And you should come with us." The next morning, Catherine found Ethan already awake, staring out his window at the grounds he hadn't crossed in 4 years. "Did you ask my dad?" he said. "I told him. There's a difference." James appeared in the doorway behind her, dressed not in his usual business suit but in jeans and a shirt Catherine suspected he hadn't worn in years. Ethan's eyes went wide. "Dad, I'm coming with you," James said. "If you'll have me." What followed wasn't graceful or easy. James carried Ethan down the front steps while Catherine brought the wheelchair. At the edge of the lawn where the manicured grass gave way to wild ground, they all stopped. "The chair won't make it through that terrain," Ethan said, and Catherine heard the resignation in his voice, the expectation of disappointment he'd learned to preemptively accept. "Then we adapt," Catherine said. She'd brought blankets, padding, and a garden cart she'd found in the greenhouse. Together, she and James created a makeshift transport, cushioned and stable. It looked ridiculous, this millionaire and his maid hauling his son through the woods in a glorified wagon. It was also the first real thing that had happened in this family in years. The creek was smaller than Catherine expected but more beautiful, a clear stream tumbling over smooth stones, dappled with leaf shadow and morning light. James lifted Ethan from the cart and carried him to the water's edge, settling beside him on the bank. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Ethan reached down and let his fingers trail in the cold water. She liked the sound, he said softly. Mom, she said it reminded her that things keep moving, even when we think we're stuck. James's breath hitched. I'm sorry, he said. Ethan, I am so sorry. Not just for the accident. For shutting down. For making you think that you had to stop trying because I couldn't bear to watch you hurt. I thought. Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. I thought if I got better, if I walked again, it would mean she died for nothing. Like I had to stay broken because she was gone. Oh, God. James pulled his son against him. No, Ethan. Your mom loved you more than anything in this world. If she could see you now, the only thing that would break her heart is knowing you've been holding yourself back. He pulled away enough to look his son in the eyes. She'd want you to fight. To try. To live so completely that it honors what she can't have anymore. Ethan crumpled then, and James held him while 4 years of grief finally poured out. Catherine turned away, giving them privacy, but James called to her. Thank you, he said simply. For seeing what I was too afraid to look at. The change didn't happen overnight. Healing never does. But it started there, by the creek, with the sound of water and the truth finally spoken aloud. James found Ethan's old physical therapy team and fired them, bringing in new specialists who treated his son as a whole person rather than a broken body. But more than that, he showed up. He attended the PT sessions. He celebrated tiny victories, a toe wiggling, a leg muscle firing, the first time Ethan supported his own weight for 3 seconds. Catherine stayed, no longer as just a maid but as part of the strange, wounded family that was learning to knit itself back together. She taught Ethan the medical knowledge she'd gained in nursing school, showing him how the body healed, helping him understand that recovery wasn't betrayal of his mother's memory but a tribute to it. 6 months later, Catherine was in the kitchen when she heard shouting from the physical therapy room James had set up. She ran, fearing the worst, and found James on his knees, tears streaming down his face. Ethan stood, legs trembling, hands white-knuckled on the parallel bars, but standing, with a grin that could have lit the entire mansion. Dad, I'm doing it. He lasted 8 seconds before his legs gave out, but those 8 seconds changed everything. It took another year of grueling work. There were setbacks and frustrations, days when Ethan cried from pain and exhaustion, days when James had to leave the room because watching his son struggle was unbearable. But they pushed through together, all 3 of them. On the 2-year anniversary of Catherine's arrival, Ethan walked unassisted from his bedroom to the creek. It took 40 minutes, with breaks and trembling legs and determination that seemed to radiate from him like heat. James walked beside him, not helping unless asked, learning to let his son struggle and triumph on his own terms. At the creek, Ethan stood in the water up to his ankles, feeling the current, alive in a way that had nothing to do with just his legs working. She'd be proud of you, James said. She'd be proud of us, Ethan corrected. He looked at his father, then at Catherine. All of us. Catherine's phone buzzed with a text from her sister. Mom's last bill is paid off. We're free. How can I ever thank you? She looked at Ethan standing in the creek, at James with his arm around his son, at the way sunlight filtered through the trees exactly as Ethan had described from his memories. She thought about how she'd come here broken too, carrying her own grief and failure, and how healing others had somehow healed her as well. No thanks needed, she typed back. I'm exactly where I need to be. That evening, the 3 of them sat on the terrace as the sun set over grounds that no longer felt like a prison. James had loosened his tie. Ethan sat in his wheelchair not because he had to but because walking still tired him, and Catherine had kicked off her shoes, no longer trying to maintain the formal distance between employer and employee. What do you think would have happened, Ethan asked quietly, if Kat hadn't come? James considered the question seriously. I think we would have stayed frozen. I would have kept trying to protect you from pain by preventing you from feeling anything at all. You would have stayed locked in guilt that was never yours to carry. We would have lived in this beautiful house and died inside it, bit by bit, without ever really being alive. That's dark, Dad. That's honest. James looked at Catherine. Sometimes the people who save us aren't the ones we expect. Sometimes they're stubborn young women who refuse to accept that broken is the same as finished. Catherine felt her face flush. I just asked what he wanted. Everyone else was so busy deciding what he needed. That's not a just, James said. That's everything. 3 years later, Catherine stood in the same foyer where she'd arrived with one battered suitcase. Now she had a completed nursing degree, paid for by James's scholarship in Margaret Winchester's name. Ethan stood beside her without assistance, preparing for his first day at the local high school, nervous and excited in equal measure. James had restructured his entire company to spend more time at home, and the mansion that once echoed with silence now rang with music and laughter and the messy sounds of life being lived. You don't have to go, Ethan said, though they'd had this conversation a dozen times. Your family now. I know, Catherine said. But there are other families out there, frozen in their own grief. Other people who need someone to ask them what they want instead of telling them what they can't have. She'd been accepted to a graduate program in rehabilitative therapy, with plans to specialize in treating patients whose physical conditions were tangled up with trauma and loss. The Winchesters had shown her that medicine without compassion was just mechanics, and that sometimes the most powerful intervention was simply seeing people as human. Promise you'll visit, James said, and hugged her with the unself-conscious warmth of someone who'd learned that letting people in was stronger than keeping them out. Every month, Catherine promised. And you have to promise me something. Anything. Keep living. Keep trying. Keep believing that stuck isn't the same as finished. As she drove away from the Winchester estate, Catherine glanced in her rearview mirror. Ethan and James stood on the front steps, waving, backlit by the warm light spilling from the house. They looked like what they were. Survivors, healers, a family that had learned the hard way that love meant witnessing each other's pain and celebrating each other's victories with equal intensity. The story spread through the community, as stories do. The millionaire's son who learned to walk again. But those who heard it secondhand missed the truth at its center. Ethan hadn't been unable to walk because of his injury. He'd been unable to try because he'd learned that trying meant risking loss, disappointment, and more grief than he could bear. Catherine hadn't healed his legs. She'd reminded him that being human meant trying anyway, that love wasn't about preventing pain but about standing witness to it. That the bravest thing anyone can do is want something when everything in their history says wanting leads to loss. Years later, when Catherine ran her own rehabilitative therapy center, she kept a photo on her desk. It showed a boy standing in a creek, sunlight filtering through trees, his father beside him, all of them laughing at something long forgotten. Beneath it, she'd written the words she told every new patient. The question isn't whether you can heal. The question is, what do you want? And are you brave enough to try for it? Because in the end, that's what changed everything for Ethan Winchester. Not a medical miracle, not expensive treatments, just one person who saw him as someone capable of wanting, deserving, and fighting for his own life. And sometimes, that's the only miracle anyone needs.